When I was 17 months old, we were at a family reunion, and my dad and my mother, we were all there together, and then my dad had to go somewhere, so he went out to the car to leave, and because of all the people around, I apparently snuck out the door also behind him. He didn't know it, and so whenever he got in the car to leave, started to back up, I was behind the car, and he ran over me. When he ran over me, it actually pulled me up into the wheel well, is the way they described it, and because it hung on to the side of my head and my hair there, and it pulled me up into it, it ripped this ear completely off. This was off and on the ground, and my scalp was ripped from here all the way across to this ear, and all of the front half of the scalp was pulled down to just above my eyes. And so whenever my dad heard a noise, he got out and looked, and I was lying still under the car, and he thought I was dead. So he just panicked and ran into the house and started yelling, "I've killed our baby, I've killed our baby." And the whole family, of course, came piling out. My grandfather saw me, picked me up, and had the wherewithal to also pick up my ear that was next to me and put me in his truck and then drove me to the hospital, which was only about 3 blocks away. And so when they took me there, he gave me the doctor. My parents showed up right after that. The doctor took me in for surgery instantly, of course. As they started sewing me up, it took a while to do. And after about an hour and a half of surgery, the doctor actually came out and was talking to my parents and said, "He's going to die. There's nothing we can do about it. It looks like too much damage. Just get ready, to bury him." And so that he was trying to prepare them for my death. And at that time, and my dad was raised Nazarene and Methodist, basically. My mother was raised Pentecostal. And so whenever the doctor said that, my mother began praying. Now, you have to remember, too, my mother was very young when I was born. She was married when she was 16. My dad was 17 at the time, and I was born actually while she was still 16. I mean, it was that quick. And so she went to praying and told God, "God, you got to let him live. If you'll let him live, I'll raise him for you. I'll dedicate him to you. I'll train him for you. Just let him live." So then the doctor had already gone back in, was doing some more surgery, and he came back out after about another hour and a half and said, "Well, we can't find any signs of brain damage at this point, but it looks like he might actually live." And they said, "If he lives, but even if he does live, he's going to have he said, "I would have brain damage," and he said, "I would never have any hair, and I would never have any hearing in my ear because they would just sewed it back on." And so he went back, do some more work. My mom went back to praying. And, "God, that's good. You're going to let him live, but if you're going to let him live, then let him be normal." And I always joke and say, "Well, it's still a question as to whether I'm normal or not." But, it's like I told him, if I'm not, leave me alone. It's working for me, right? So, but during that time, my mom was praying and just praying that God would, let me live, but also make me normal to the degree, at least that I am, I guess. And it's funny because they the doctor kept coming back out and saying, okay, well, we hadn't found any signs of brain damage, but he'll never have any hair in his head. He'll never have any hearing in his ear. And he'd go back in, and my mom would go back to praying, and whatever he said, my mom would pray against. And she just kept on praying. So eventually, he said, well, no matter what, we can't find any signs of brain damage yet, but he'll probably just be a vegetable all of his life, and that's just, you have to deal with that. And I said, that makes sense. That's why I don't eat vegetables to this day. So, because they say you are what you eat, so I'm, not taking any chances there. So, but we had, and during that time, it took about 6 hours of surgery altogether, but it took 172 stitches across my head and back of the ear and all that, and I still have a scar on the back of my head that you can see pretty good. Usually, especially I just got my hair cut yesterday, so it's short enough where you can usually see it. But also behind the ear, you can see where it was sewn back on and all that. And then there's a spot right here that actually feels like, I don't know, it just feels almost like plastic. I mean, they didn't put anything in there. I mean, there's nothing there like that, but it just always kind of felt different. But even as I was growing up, I would feel things in my scalp, and you just kind of, because it'll bug you, and you keep messing with it until it breaks through the skin, and it would be pieces of gravel. And I'm talking, well, actually there's one piece still right there. Had never got that one to break through yet, but it's still there. I can feel it. And my wife was, yeah, see, rocks in your head. I knew it. So, and she used to say, well, when they put you back together, they left out the common sense. I said, well, then God didn't figure it was necessary. So there you go. So, but anyway, because my mom had dedicated me to God, then growing up, when I turned 9, actually my dad was a police officer. He worked nights, so he'd come home, and my mom would go to work. And usually on Sunday, if she had to go to work, then she would get me up. I'd get dressed and watch television, usually watch Oral Roberts, Catherine Coleman, Rex Humbard, if you remember Rex Humbard. I would watch them on television until she went to work, and then I would walk across the street to this little Nazarene church that was there. And we weren't Nazarene necessarily, but it was the closest church that I could actually walk to. And so we went there, and that's where I got saved when I was 9 years old. And so then after that, I knew God was with me, but I didn't know how to walk with Him, put it that way. And so then when I was 17, God actually called, as I would say, and I knew that I was supposed to be preaching. Didn't know how I was going to do it, didn't know how to do it, but went and told my parents, this is what, I know what God wants me to do. And that's when my mom told me about how she had dedicated me to God. She never told me that before. I knew God had spared my life, but I didn't know about everything else, because she said she didn't want to influence me. She wanted God to call me if He was going to call me. So now as I was growing up, though, because of the damage done and everything for a while, just because they were young, they wanted to keep me at home, and so I didn't start school when everybody else did. So my mom taught me how to read by using the King James Bible. And so for years, until I started school, we read through the Bible usually a couple of times every year. In the beginning, though, she would teach me to read by using the Bible, and at first she would read it to me, and then she would have me read it back to her. And we used to joke, because in the beginning, she used to read me to sleep with the Bible, and then later on, I would read her to sleep with the Bible. And we said later, even after that, when I went in ministry, I said, guess what? I'm still reading people to sleep with the Bible. It still works. So, but I had, because of that, I didn't know it, but that was God having her put Scripture in me. And I didn't, and I was never big on chapter and verse. I couldn't tell you where it was at and that kind of stuff, but I knew the Scripture, and so it would come out. So all that time growing up, whenever I was 17, like I said, that's whenever I knew God wanted me to go into full-time ministry. Didn't know how to make it happen. To make a long story short, I was teaching martial arts at the time, and that was going to be my career, and I was going to open schools, a chain of schools and all this, and we actually did open several. But, and I always told my students, most of my students, I would get saved. I'd be witnessing to them and training them at the same time. And many of them, matter of fact, there was a couple of them I baptized right here at the swimming pool back from 1991, I guess it was, something like that. I'd baptize them in different hotel swimming pools because most churches wouldn't let me use their baptistry because I wasn't a minister. So I'd have to go to a swimming pool, and I'd have some other students watch for security while we'd run in and baptize them, get back out. So, so we had, but I always told them, I said, listen, this is what I'm doing, but I know what I'm supposed to be doing. So if I ever really obey God, then you come here and the door's closed and it'll say gone preaching, because that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And so eventually I was driving down to South Texas one time, going down to open up another school. I was driving down the road and God spoke to me and he said, how long are you going to pursue something that has an end when you can pursue me and I have no end? And so I pulled over and had to dwell upon it a little bit, and then kept driving a bit further, and he said, you're using your hands to teach people to kill. I want to use your hands to teach people to heal. And so at that point, I turned around and headed back home and shut down my schools and went to work in fast food because I knew that was a job I could get quick and easy, and one that I would not have to think about too much while I was there, so that I could actually give myself to study the Word. And so I went with that. We had our first daughter. Her name was Erica. She was born with a hemangioma tumor. And the hemangioma tumor is a bunch of blood vessels grown together almost like a ball of twine together. If you've seen these balls of like rubber bands, they're almost like that, but it's all blood vessels. And so it's just a ball. It's about as big as my fist when she was born. And as I said, she was our firstborn. There was nothing there on any of the sonograms and all that stuff, nothing. But the second she was born, it was there. And it was about the size of my fist, and it was in her tongue, which made her tongue very large, of course, and was outside of her mouth because she couldn't pull it back into her mouth. So it was a shock. It didn't look like a tongue. It was very, you could tell it was a tongue, but it was very thin, and you could almost see through it and see the blood vessels and everything. So we had never heard of anything like this. Matter of fact, neither had the doctors or anybody else around her. She was the first child ever born with that tumor in her tongue or in a tongue. Usually there are other places inside the head, body, different things like that, but never had been there. So immediately they put her in a plane. We chartered a plane. My parents actually had to pay for it. And we chartered a plane and flew from Sherman, which is just north of here, down to Galveston, Texas, to John Seeley Hospital, where they put her immediately into intensive care. All kinds of things happened. They had to put a tracheotomy in her because she couldn't breathe with her tongue. And even then, sometimes her tongue would go over the trach and almost suffocate her. They told us all kinds of things. All of it was very doom and gloom. And so I was working at the time, but my wife had to stay in Galveston with her, and then I would have to come back and forth to the work and then go down there on the weekends and stay any days off that I had. So we did this for 6 months. 6 months we got her out of the hospital. They told us we had to pay over $180,000 in a doctor's bill, which, we're talking about 1978. So that was, it might as well have been $100 million because I didn't have any of it. And so we started praying. I said, God, they won't let us take our daughter out here until this is paid, so we need some help. And a little bit later that day, the AMA Medical Journal came down and said, if you will let us put her in our medical journal because this is so unusual, then we will take care of all your doctor bills. And so we signed it, and so she is in the AMA Medical Journal for 1978. And so from that, we took her home. Then she grew. It was amazing. They said if she ever grew teeth, she would cut into this thing and she would bleed to death. If we ever lived more than 5 minutes away from the hospital, if she cut her tongue, she would bleed to death. Just one thing after another. They said we had to feed her through a nasal gastric tube. We had to clean out the trach and do the suction for the trach and do all this stuff. And when you do that, you have to do it within a certain amount of time, a few seconds, or they could actually suffocate. If you're inserting or taking out the nasal gastric tube, if you don't do it right and you get it wrong, it can go in their lungs and you can actually drown them with the food that you put them in. I mean, you have to remember, at this point, I am 18, 19, going, yeah, I'm 19. My wife is 18, is our first child. We didn't know anything. And here we are having to basically be doctors to take care of our child at home. And so this went on for a good period of time. Right after that, we had our son, John. He was born on March 9th in 1980. And Erica was born, as we said here before, on November 17th of 1978. And then, so we traveled a little bit. I tried to launch out into ministry at times. Yes, it worked. No, it didn't work. That kind of stuff. Just different things. But we had one year that was an amazing year. Amazing miracles took place. But then she was still alive at that point. Then we came back to the North Texas area. And on Friday, the 13th, February 1981, she passed away. Now, we had been everywhere. I mean, anybody, as soon as she was born with this, I started really investigating healing, because I knew God had healed me. I knew he had spared me, so I knew God could, just didn't know how to get him to do it. And so anywhere there was a healing service or any books on healing, I started getting them. I started reading them, studying them. And we were actually seeing results. We were actually seeing progress. We just didn't get it fast enough. And so we had gone everywhere, went to every camp meeting. Everybody laid hands on her. Everybody prayed for her. Everybody knew her and knew us because of her. Then after John was born, my son, the next year, well, actually, when Erica passed away on Friday the 13th, 1981, we buried her the next day, which was February 14th, or Valentine's Day. When we buried her, as soon as she died, I immediately started calling all the people that we knew that had healing ministries, and I couldn't get a hold of anybody, couldn't get anybody on the telephone. All the big name people couldn't do it. At the time, I'll be honest with you, I got pretty upset with that and had some bitterness for a long time. I understand it now, a little bit better, but at the same time, this was my daughter. So when we buried her, and she's actually buried just about probably 12 minutes up the road here, on the way into McKinney. On the left-hand side of the road, there's a large cemetery there with a large cross in it, and that's where she's buried. She was one of the first babies buried there in their Babyland section. And so when we stood there at that grave, we'd called everybody. Nobody, couldn't get anybody, couldn't get any answers. So we stood there, and I'll never forget it because it was cold, and it was, we'd called everybody. And I stood there and made a vow to God. And I said, God, there was no man for me when I needed one. But if you will teach me the truth about your power, about healing, I will be that man for someone else so that they don't have to have a grave like I do. And then we watched that little white casket go down in the ground, which they didn't want us standing there, but we weren't going to leave yet. And so as they put the dirt in on top of it, we made that vow to God, and then that launched us. From that point on, honestly, most of our family thought we were going to backslide away from God. Some of our family tried to blame it on God. They tried to say, oh, this was God's will, which by that time, at least I had enough good teaching to know that wasn't true. And so, but I started searching. And instead of falling away from God, I got obsessed. And I mean obsessed, to the point where people literally thought I had lost my mind. They thought I had just lost it. But I was determined to find truth. And to be honest with you, I didn't care what truth I found. I just wanted the truth of God. So we searched everything, got every book on healing I could find. Most of what they said I could already prove wasn't true, just from what the Bible said. And then, but I kept hearing about I heard about Smith Wigglesworth, amazing man of God. But I also heard about this guy named John Lake. And everything I heard about him, I thought, okay, this is pretty interesting, because Wigglesworth had amazing miracles, but he didn't really train anybody to do what he did. I said, he had Dr. Summerall later on, I knew this, but I said, John Lake was different. He actually took people and trained them, and they got the same results he did, and in some cases even better. I said, so if you got a guy that can do it and teach it, this guy knows what he's talking about. So then I started trying to find out how to get in touch with him, and then I found out he had died in 1935. So next thing was I started finding people that were related to him, and I kept digging until I found Will and Gertrude, and they were up in Washington at the time, So I started calling them. And you have to remember, this was all landlines, no cell phones. This was actually I started calling from 1981 all the way through. And literally, as soon as I got a hold of them, one of the things I did was, back in the old days, you had these little cassette. Back then, everything was cassette. And if you're running on the phone, you could actually plug in a thing that had a suction cup on the end. You plug it on the back of the phone, and you could actually record the entire conversation. So when I started calling these people, I was calling different people, and finally I got a hold of Gertrude, and I recorded every conversation that I had with them. And so whenever she answered, she said hello, and I started talking to her, asking who she was and all this. And so I started talking with them, and actually was going through some things the other day, and I've transferred a lot of that stuff over to CD now, and so now I have those recordings, and I'm going through and transferring everything that I have, because from 81 until 87, there might have been maybe 8 or 10 weeks that I didn't talk with them, but every Monday I would call them, and I had a list of questions. And so when I would call them and ask them these questions, Will would answer them, Gertrude would answer them about her father, different things would go on, and they'd say, well, now, for that, you'd need to talk to so-and-so, and they'd give me some names and different things, and I'd call these other people and talk to them and ask them. So then, eventually, so I got all these, years of recordings saved up. So then I started putting all the answers together, saying, okay, here's what they said. And then whenever, just before Gertrude passed away, they started talking to me about me and my ministry and this kind of stuff, which at the time I had no ministry. But they started asking about these things. And then after Gertrude passed away, Will had asked me once before, he said, well, what is your testimony? And so I told him my testimony and what happened and how I got ran over by the car. And he said, well, what day was that? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, well, who asked the days? Nobody ever asked me the day. And so he said, well, can you find out? And I said, well, I guess I could ask my mom. And so I called my mom. He said, well, call your mom, find out, and get back with me. So I called my mom. I said, Mom, do you remember what day that was I got ran over by the car? She said, oh, yeah, September 16th, 1960. I'm like, how do you remember that? She said, well, some days you never forget. And I'm like, yeah, because by this time, Erica had passed. And so I'm like, yeah, I get that. So I called Will back, and I said, yeah, that was September 16th, and 1960. He said, yeah, that's what we thought. He said, when Gertrude and I discussed this, we thought you were the person because John Lake gave a prophecy on May 24th, 1934, about a person who would pick up the ministry and carry it on after he was gone, and we thought that was probably you. And so, because for years I had talked to them, and he said the first reason they thought it might be me was because in all our conversations, I never asked them how I could get John Lake's anointing. That question never came out of my mouth. And they said everybody else that called him, that was the first thing they asked. And as a matter of fact, Will asked me, he said, why didn't you ever ask that? And I said, because I figured that's up to God. I said, I figured if I could just learn everything I could about John Lake, and I put myself in the same position he was in, if that's what made God use him, then maybe God would use me. So I just figured I would just find out everything I could and do whatever he did. Paul said, imitate me as I imitate God, basically, so as I follow Christ. So, and that's the thing you'll see that I'm going to share in this one that I've never really shared much about, but I will be talking about how to imitate yourself into the person you want to be. All right, we'll talk about that during the course of this. So Will said, yeah, okay, well, I'm going to send you this. And he said there was a prophecy, and he read it to me. And then he sent it to me. And he said, I'm going to send you a bunch of other material and different things. And so they started sending me all of this material. And so I started going through it, started researching it. And it was amazing because just from researching it, it was basically all the sermons you've seen before, but unedited. Every sermon you've ever read by John Lake has been edited. And so now, sometimes the Copelands did a book. They didn't edit it. It was edited before they got it. All right? So when they said they didn't edit, they were telling the truth. It was already edited. Gordon Lindsay wrote some books on John Lake, and it says edited by Gordon Lindsay. So he edited it also. And so the sermons I got were unedited, which means if you think about it, go back and read some of the sermons you'll see in these books. They're like 5 pages long. Okay, that we're talking 7 minutes, right? Now, John Lake would preach for an hour and a half on the average. That shows you how much was cut out. Right? When I preach for 45 minutes, we'll have, I can't remember how many pages it is, but it's like 20 or 30 pages, something like that. Easy, I can't remember exactly, but it's a lot, right? And so that's why if you take an entire sermon, you might get 5 sermons in a regular sized book, but you're not going to get 44 sermons in a book that big, right? And them be unedited. So there was a lot that was cut out. I didn't know how much until I got these other sermons. Then, whenever I was still researching this, and Will sent me a list of people and names and where they were last known to live. So I started trying to search these people down, well over 100 people. Many of them were already passed away. Many of them were still alive, though, so I was able to talk with them. And whenever I would contact somebody, I had a list of questions. I would ask every one of them the exact same questions, because I figured if I ask everybody the same question, the same answers, if I got the same answers from a lot of them, that would be the truth. Because sometimes it's just perspective. And so I would look at that, but I tried to find the same answer. And so I started going through this. Then one day I heard about this woman named Pauline Parham, who used to stay over here at Christ of the Nations. She was Charles Parham's daughter-in-law. She was in East Texas or South Texas preaching, and I wanted to go down and hear her preach. So I went down, and while I was there, I remembered there were some people that had been associated with Dr. Lake from his church there, that whenever Dr. Lake went back to Spokane, he had sent down one of his divine healing technicians to Houston to take over the church from Gordon Lindsay when Gordon left. So when he went down, this divine healing technician, his name was Jeter, he went down, took his wife and his son, and when they moved to Houston, his son married a little woman there, and now we're talking 1927, 28. And so when I was there listening to Pauline Parham, I remembered this one woman had been in Houston, so I looked her up. She was in a nursing home. I went over to see her, got to talk with her. She was 92, 93 years old at the time. Started asking her questions, same questions, and I had a couple extra days, so I stayed there overnight, and I'd come back in the next day. And she said, I'd ask her these questions, and finally she just got fed up, actually, is what it was. And she just got tired of me talking to her. And cause I tell you, that, you get older, you just don't have as much patience with people, right? You're kind of like, that's a stupid question, don't ask that one. But so finally she said, well, all your questions would be answered if you just had a manual. And I said, well, yeah, that'd be great if I had one of those. Where are you going to find one of those? She goes, well, I've got one, And for those of you of my age, I felt like Fred Sanford. What do you mean? It's like, what do you mean you got one? She goes, well, I got one. I said, well, can I see it? She said, well, you can see it, but you can't have it till I die. And so her family brought it in, and I'm looking at it, and I'm trying to make as many notes as I can, but then I had to leave, and she didn't tell me till like the last day, so I had to go back. So I make as many notes, and so I gave them my address, told them where my parents lived, because I knew I might move, but I knew my parents would stay put. And so I told her, they said, she said, well, when I die, because she knew my relationship with Will, and she had known Will. And so she said, when she dies, she said, when I die, then I'll have it sent to you. Okay. So I go back home, but now I'm searching, I'm needing information. So I'm like, God, she's really old. Lord, she deserves her reward. She deserves it, Lord. She's really, so I tell everybody, it took me about 2 years to pray her to death. So finally, I'm just joking. Okay. Kinda. Anyway, but so about 2 years later, I get this package in the mail, and it's the manual. And so now, and the thing is, when I got it, there was just a couple of things I had to tweak, just a couple of little things, a few adjustments. And as soon as I made those adjustments, my success rate went up over 50%. Just bam, overnight, literally overnight. And then then I started seeing other adjustments here and there and started doing things, and it got better and better. So during this time, we were in North Texas, and we had, I was going to church, I was praying for people. I started learning these things, and it started working. So I said, okay, this works. I started praying for people in church. They started getting healed. Then people started coming to my house, and they'd say, can we come out to your home? I said, yeah. And so I had one friend of mine that was, he had known me for a little while, and he made a living playing pool. In other words, gambling, right? And so he would go to the nightclubs and the bars and be playing pool, and somebody would mention they were sick, and he'd say, okay, hang on, here, come with me, go with me, and he would bring them to my house. And so they'd drive up, and I'd pray for him, and he'd go back and finish playing pool, and they'd get healed, and he'd go back, and he's in the bar, and here these people coming from the bar, half of them were half drunk when they got there, and God would still heal them. And so I started putting all this stuff together. I'm like, wow, God really doesn't, not that he doesn't care about it, but he will answer my prayers for people that he wouldn't answer their own prayers for them, but he'd answer my prayers for them. Right? So, if you don't believe that, you ought to check about Abraham. Okay? Abraham was spared Lot, or God spared Lot because of Abraham. See? So that's called intercession. See, Christians talk like they believe in intercession, but they really don't. So, I started praying for all these people, and we had all kinds of some pretty amazing healings, both in the Walmarts, because that's where I was going to find people to pray for and see if it worked out in public, not just in church. And then people come to our house, and for 9 months, every person that came to our house got healed. Every one of them, 100%, and it didn't matter what they had or how long they had it. It didn't matter what disease it was. Why? Because it didn't matter to me. If it didn't matter to me, I knew it didn't matter to God. And so we just prayed. Cast out devils, deliverances, healings, every bit of it. Now, we had literally 100%. Now, they didn't all get healed instantly. Some of them came back 2 or 3 times. Some of them came back over a couple of weeks. Some would come when they could, that kind of thing. But every one of them got healed. Then God started dealing with me about sharing this. And I said, okay, because I told God, I said, yeah, I will share it with whatever you. I told God, I said, I'm lousy at keeping secrets. I said, you put it in my ear, it'll come out my mouth. Do you understand? And so he said, that's what I want. Whatever I put in you, I want you to pour out. And so that's what we started doing. So I started sharing, and we started traveling, and then it grew, and we started traveling really all over the world, and more, just seeing more and more tremendous healings, different things. And some of the things, you have to remember, I had nobody taught me this, okay? I was able to glean some things. But one of the things that helped was early on, I got, okay, how God orchestrated this is really amazing, how he put it all together, because at one point in my life, Jack Coe's son, Steve Coe, was my pastor. And because I knew, actually it was my mom and dad's pastor, and then I started going to the church also. But I knew about his dad, because I had read God's Generals. So I said, yeah, I'll go to Steve Coe's church. And I went and met him, talked to him. And then I said, do you have anything from your dad? He said, oh, yeah, we got videos, we got audio, we got some cassette things, and we've got some VHS tapes. I'm like, whatever you got, I'll take it all. So he gave me a bunch of videos and stuff of Jack Coe. And so I've got all of those things. So I started watching those. Then, especially as I started traveling a little bit, I got a hold of a man named Simeon Stewart, who was a prophet that was also ordained under A.A. Allen. And so that was another stream that God brought into my life. I lived we lived here in Dallas, and just east of here is a town called Lindale, where Leonard Ravenhill lived. And so when I knew he was there, that's where David Wilkerson lived, and Keith Green, and all those guys lived in that same area. And so when I found out Leonard Ravenhill lived there, I started writing him letters. And I was actually going through some things the other day and found the letters he had written back, inviting me to come down and pray with him and all these things. And so God orchestrated where all of these other lives we started having access to. And so I started getting a hold of all the A. Allen videos, all the Jack Coe videos. Some people had been connected with William Branham, so I got a hold of his videos. This is before internet. This is before anything was out there. I mean, internet was around, but nobody was using it. And so I had all these videotapes. I'd put them in our VHS, and most of my kids, I think at that time, had already moved out of the house. It was just me and my wife there. And I'd go in there at night, and I was working during the day, so I'd go in at night, put in this VHS, and just push play. And we'd sit there, man, we'd eat popcorn and watch this stuff, and she's like, can't we watch something else? I'm like, no, watch this, watch it. She goes, you've already seen this 100 times. I'm like, I know, it's better every time. Watch it, watch this, So and we just watch it and watch it. And so, and many times, she'd say, okay, I'm going to bed. I've seen this before. I'm like, okay, and I'd sit there and I'd fall asleep, but it was a VHS. So it goes to the end, and when it hits the end, then it starts rewinding. And it would get louder and louder the faster and faster it got. And it would go whack when it hit the end. And I'd wake up and go, push play again. Let's watch it again. Just keep on going. And but I watched that. And I remember sitting there and I'm thinking, God, we need that. The church needs that. God, I don't see that in church. We need that. God, we got to have that. We got to have that. And so I'm just watching this. And that's as close as I could get to those guys. They were all gone. I didn't know it. Jack Coe's buried right over here near Christ of Nations. His wife, Juanita Coe, I met her once. She's buried over there. All these different people are buried there all around, but you can't get to them because they're all dead now. And so I'm watching all the videos. I'm watching these things over and over and just crying out to God, God, this is what we need. This is what we need. So finally, do I have to? Oh, we're doing good. Okay. I'm trying to keep on time here. So I'm watching all these, and so I would sit there, and I would just, when Jack Coe would grab somebody and pull them out of a wheelchair, I was grabbing them out. I'd watch how he did it, and we need that right there, And it was so funny because I remember, because Jack Coe, I mean, you had A. Allen, you had Jack Coe, two totally different people, totally different kinds of people. Now you can see most of these videos online. You look them up, you can watch them, you can watch a lot of different things. But Jack Coe was a big guy, and he had a deep voice, and he was really, I mean, none of these guys came from church. So they didn't have the nice church personalities, right? They were just about effectiveness, which I really appreciated. And so Jack Coe, I'll never forget this woman, little bitty woman, came up, she had the glass on, and she comes up, a little bun in her hair, standing there, and he says, he's got this big old microphone, and back then, they don't have these little things, they had this big old mic, right? And sometimes they'd hang them around their neck, It's like rappers think they had it. Man, we had bling way before the rappers had it, right? Had a big old microphone hanging off your neck. But Jack Coe would take that microphone and go, "Oh, Mama, what's wrong with you?" And she, "My back hurts." And just really, back, I got a back pain. And he'd go, "All right." And he'd walk around. I always wonder what they thought when he walked around behind them. Because she'd be standing like this, and he would walk around behind her. And so, I was watching this today, and it's so funny because he grabbed her on the shoulders, this one woman, put his knee in her back, and pulled her back. And you ought to see her faces, And there was another one time where he just looks at her, and he grabs her by the face. And his hands covered her head, and he grabs her, and he goes, "Down, up, down, up." And this little woman's going down, and every time she's coming, she's like, Yeah. And it's like she's screaming, "Help me, somebody," And he's down, up, and he turns loose and he grabs me and goes, "How's that?" And she's like, I mean, she is stunned, And she goes, "I'm healed." "I thought so," And he'd just kind of push her on out of the way, just go on out, and she'd go off kind of stunned, but totally well. So you got Jack Coe that's really rough with people, and then you got A. Allen, who was really much better at like what people call corporate anointing and having the people join in with him. But he was so funny because, and see, you start to realize all these people. Like A. Allen, well, Jack Coe too, but A. Allen, smaller guy, Assemblies of God. I preached in his church in Clifton, in Colorado, where he started before he started his tent revivals, and he was. He was real energetic, okay, and real demonstrative. I mean, he was real, almost theatrical. Well, yeah, you'd say theatrical. And so, but it's so funny because he would have this song director, right? And if you watch the old videos, you'll see two different people, song directors. One guy's kind of a tall, thin guy, gray-headed, but he was amazing because when he led the song, he was so energetic, and he would just stand and bounce and just jump up and down and have the people singing, And then he'd say, "And now here's our man of faith and power for the hour, your evangelist, A. Allen." And he'd step out of the way, and Allen would have his Bible, and he'd be coming from the back, and he would, And he looked like Groucho Marx. You know how he did that? He'd say, "Who believes God?" And everybody yell. So then they would come down. They had this lady on a stretcher, and he would look at it, and he'd say, "Well, what is wrong?" "Beloved, believe God." "What's wrong with her?" "She's dying of cancer." "All right. Do you believe God can heal her?" And the crowd's, yeah, all right. So then he'd grab it was like a matador. He'd grab the blanket, And then he would look at this woman, and he would look so tender at her, and then yank her out of that thing. I mean, up and off and whenever she landed, she was healed. It was amazing things. I mean, so I'm sitting there watching all this stuff, right? And I'm like, yeah, we need that on here. And whenever Jack Coe was doing this, I was doing this, right? When they were yanking people out of wheelchairs, I'm like, yeah, bless God, we're going to be yanking them out of wheelchairs, you know? And I was convinced that's the answer. You just got to be violent, you know? So and I'm watching William Branham, and he's totally different. He'd just stand there, just so calm, just stand there. He'd say, well, I'm just waiting on the angel of the Lord. Somebody come up and say, now, have we ever met? No? Okay. Well, now, you came down here, and you were in a black 1949 Ford. The license plate was EJ 1434. Matter of fact, you live at 1523 Indiana Avenue, and you were coming down. When you were coming, matter of fact, you were in the back. Why were you sitting in the back seat? Your husband was driving, and your husband had a black. Now, you had a red hat on. That ain't the hat you had on. But your husband had a black. What? And that's your husband right back there. Why isn't he sitting with you? And he was just going all this stuff. And just, I mean, details, right? And he'd say, now, is this true? And this woman would be going, I mean, she just, because he's reading her mail, and she's just crying. He said, is that true? Yeah. Now, if the Lord showed me all that about you, don't you think he cares enough to heal you? Yeah, go your way, you're healed. That was it. And she'd walk off healed. See, but now notice, different ways. Okay, grabbing, working of miracles. Simply, why? Because you're working it. You're doing something, right? It's a working. You have to do something. That's why you never see it. Because nobody wants to take that chance. See, everybody wants to walk by faith. Why? Because faith just stands there and says, watch and see the salvation of God. See, faith is done for you. Working of miracles, you got to do something to work it. So there's different good. But you can get somebody healed with a word of knowledge. So you can tell them what God's doing. You can tell them what's going on. And people, what it does is, when you use a word of knowledge, their faith rises enough for them to get it for themselves. So there's all this goes in. So you can use any of the gifts to get anybody healed, right? It's just how you operate in that gift. And so I'm watching all this. I'm like, yeah, we need that. Yeah, we need this. Yeah. So then I had this little VW Volkswagen. Well, VW is a Volkswagen. It was a station wagon, piece of junk. It was junk. I mean, it got me from A to B sometimes. And so, but it was a piece of junk car. And I was coming back from East Texas one time. I dropped off my wife and the kids down there to stay with her grandparents for a weekend. And so I was coming back, and I'm driving down this back road. And I'm telling you, God was in that car, because it scared me, okay? And I'm driving along, and I'm praying so, man, it sounds so holy. And I'm like, God, God, we got to have a gift of healing. God, I got to have a gift of healing. I need a gift of healing. God, we need the gift of healing. And it's like God was sitting in the back seat, because that's where it sounded like it came from. It's where one of those times you're driving, he speaks, and you want to, where'd it come from? And he said, do you want a gift of healing or a gift of feeling? And I said, well, it's a gift of healing, of course. He said, then what makes you think you don't have one already? I said, because I don't feel like it. And so I realized that the feeling had nothing to do with faith. The feeling had nothing to do with healing, right? And so I'm driving on. Now, and there's a couple other things like that God did over the period. There's a little piece. I wish I could say it just came natural and came, smoothly. It didn't. It was up and down and back and all this, and it was bits and pieces here and there and putting it together. But God was constantly. Now, if I had known how to yield more, I'd have traveled much faster in God. But I didn't know how to do that, so I had to learn, because I didn't have anybody to teach me that stuff. So I'm watching all these things and watching these videos and just telling God, we've got to have that back in the church. And then whenever we did launch out, I started realizing there were situations I would come into, and somebody would stand in front of me, and it's like I would see that video, and I would just do what I saw. Now, it wasn't like God was telling me what to do. He just reminded me, okay, here's what A. Allen did. So I just did what Allen did. And guess what? It worked. And I'll never forget, because there was 2 times, I'll tell you real quick before we send you out. There was 2 times. Once I was in Branson, Missouri. We were in a Best Western hotel, I guess. And there was a little woman there. And I watched the videos later. But whoever was actually it was my son, was running the camera. And he had it really from the waist up. So all you could see is there. But I remember I'm standing there, and I'm fixing to pray for this little woman. And I'm just fixing to lay hands on her. And I moved forward, and you could tell how I moved. And I watched it later, a different meeting, but same kind of movement. And before I ever touched this woman falls to the ground. There was no carpet. I mean, that was her head. And as soon, I'm like, oh, no, oh, you know? And my first instinct was I looked at the person next to me, I said, I never touched her. I didn't touch her. That was my first thing. I'm not kidding. Later, when I watched the video, when she fell, her feet came up. And you could see it, because all you could see is from way, but her feet came up into the video. So real quickly, I'm like, okay, be blessed. And I'm ready to pray for the next person. And I'm going down, and they're praying. I'm praying for everybody. And this little woman is sitting over there, and a friend of ours, kind of got down behind her on the floor, held her up, talking to her, making sure, because I'm expecting to see a pool of blood. I mean, I'm thinking she's cracked her head open. And so they said, well, come back over and pray for her, because, she's kind of coming back too. And I'm like, okay. So I walked back over, and I was just fixing to touch her. Whack! She does it again. And I'm like, I ain't praying for her again. I'm not going to do it again. And so, and then somebody came to me later and said, oh, that's the Spirit. That's what the Spirit does to her every time. It happens. I'm like, okay. But she got completely healed. But I thought I was going to pray for a headache or something, because she hit hard. But then later, I watched the other videos of other meetings, and I noticed, and the reason I'm telling you this is because I'm moving, so I don't talk about this a lot, but I'm moving back into this. And so you'll probably see some of it maybe tonight. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But I noticed, it was the funniest thing, because when I started to pray for people back then especially, I didn't know anything other than to grab them by the head and pray. Now, I was always careful because I didn't want to push anybody. You always hear about people pushing people down, all that kind of stuff. So I've always been really careful not to do that. So when I would grab people, if I moved, and you see where my hands are, if I moved, my arms moved, my hands wouldn't move. Go on, because I didn't want to push them. See, I could grab them and push, and they'd go down. I don't want that. If they go down, I want to be God. So I just grab them, but I would move, but my hands would stay in place, right? Like shock absorbers, right? So, but the video was from a distance, and they could see all of me. And it was the funniest thing, because I'm standing there, and I'm like, okay, what do you need? What do you need? And they're telling me. And I said, and as I was listening, I watched the video later, and I put my foot back, and I raised my heel, okay? And this is how you launch forward, right? And I realized that I said, okay, and I got ready, and all of a sudden, I could see the change in me when I started to pray for them. I could see it. I sensed it because I was watching it. But it's like I felt like a lion about to pounce on prey. That's literally the way it felt. And I remember I'm standing there, and I'm like, yeah, and I just kind of put my foot back, and then I raise that heel because that's going to give me my push. And all of a sudden, I'm like, receive! And I grabbed him by the head and just jump, and it was exactly like watching Jack Coe and those guys, and I okay, check it out, and they're like, I'm healed, and I'm like, I just ran and go, I thought so, right? Why? So, but see, the thing was, I'm going to be honest. I'm going to confess right now, because we've seen God do some amazing things. But I know, and I've noticed this, and really, I've seen this. I could name the ministers, and if you've watched them very long, you'd know it too. There's this thing. We have to remember this race, it is a sprint. It's not a marathon. Now, we have to last it like a marathon, but we got to run it full out. See, marathoners don't run full out. They pace themselves. That's what ministers do. That's what I've done. I pace myself. I'm tired of pacing myself. I want to go full on, full out. I mean, every bit, every day, as much, as fast as we can. And the thing is, I realized that I had calmed down. Why? For just convenience sake. In the early days, you wouldn't believe the flack we caught just because of how I ministered. Just the things going on and how people, they didn't like it, But the results were phenomenal. And we still get good results. But if you're preaching a full-on gospel, you ought to get full-on results. Amen? And so I decided, end of last year, beginning of this year, I'm done with pacing myself. I don't care who likes it, who don't. I don't care if the crowds get bigger. I don't care if they get smaller. I don't care. We want to go all out. Amen? And so I can't promise you what tonight's going to be like, because I don't even know myself. And, and tomorrow, this place may be empty. Maybe none of y'all come back. I don't know. But regardless, Jesus is going to be glorified. Amen? Amen. Go ahead, let's go. Amen. Hey guys, I just wanted to welcome you. I'm Curry Blake, General Overseer of John G. Lake Ministries. We are so glad that you have decided to take the step to investigate life teams, becoming a certified divine healing technician, getting plugged in and taking the responsibility to enter into the life that Jesus has actually died to give us. So the next step now, since you've come this far, is to simply sign up. That's how to get started. Just sign up. And when you do, now you're going to go ahead and check your email box. And you're going to get instructions on how to become certified DHT, how to start a life team. But you know, and maybe some of you are already within JGLM and you're already a leader at some level, and you're saying, okay, why do I have to do this? Well, it's very simple. We're putting everybody into the same system so that it works like a well-oiled machine, like we've talked about, because we want to make sure everything is working very well together. So if you are an existing leader within JGLM, we can tell you nothing's going to change. We're just gathering the information, so it's all in one database, and we are going to be able to communicate with you a lot better. This is going to really solve the communication problems that we've had over the past. But this is a new day, and you get to get right into it. So sign up, do it now. Don't wait, do it now, and then check your email box. It's just that simple. So listen, I really appreciate this. Jesus appreciates this because you're plugging in and you're wanting to take responsibility. So I look forward to working with you. We're going to have a great time advancing the kingdom. God bless you.
We would like to thank our partners and friends for making today's broadcast possible. If you enjoyed today's message or would like more information and resources, please visit our website at jglm.org.
Above all things, warrior, King of kings, mighty God, Prince of peace, angel armies at his feet, lightning clouds and thunder rolls, all the earth will shake.
If you are considering partnering with us and would like to support our mission, please visit jglm.org/partners. Proceeds will go toward the cost of the television broadcast and our mission work around the world. If you enjoyed the teaching, this series and those previously aired are available for purchase online at jglm.org.
Visit jglmmedia.com to watch this program and more at any time. Subscribe for full access to our entire library, or you can rent, buy, and watch for free select resources. With over 700 hours of teaching to watch and more being added, we've got your needs covered.
Take these hearts of stone away in us, the Lord.